The morning air was crisp as thousands of people gathered outside Buckingham Palace. It was changing of the guard ceremony day, and tourists from around the world had come to witness this famous British tradition. Among the crowd stood Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old United States Marine who was visiting London during his 2-week leave. Marcus had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a seasoned military man. His back was straight, his eyes alert, and even in civilian clothes, people could sense his military background. He had come to London to clear his head after his latest deployment, hoping the change of scenery would help him process everything he had experienced overseas. As the ceremony began, the iconic red-coated guards marched in perfect formation. Their tall black bearskin hats bobbed rhythmically as they moved with precision that only comes from years of training. The crowd watched in respectful silence, phones and cameras capturing every moment of the ancient ritual. Among the guards was James Wellington, a 26-year-old member of the Queen's Guard, who had been protecting the royal family for 4 years. James took immense pride in his role and had earned respect from his fellow guardsmen for his unwavering dedication to duty. His family had a long tradition of military service, and he considered his position one of the highest honors a British soldier could achieve. The ceremony proceeded without incident until something unexpected happened. A small child, no more than 5 years old, had somehow slipped past the barriers and wandered directly into the path of the marching guards. The little boy stood frozen in the middle of the courtyard, overwhelmed by the sight of the tall soldiers approaching him. The crowd gasped as they realized what was happening. Parents in the audience covered their children's eyes, fearing what might occur next. Everyone knew the guards were not supposed to break formation or acknowledge distractions during their duty. They were trained to march straight ahead, regardless of what crossed their path. James was the lead guard in the formation, and the child stood directly in his route. According to protocol, he should continue marching and let the child move out of the way on his own. But as he looked down at the terrified little face staring up at him, something stirred in his chest. The boy reminded him of his own nephew back home. In that split second, James made a decision that would change everything. He stopped marching and broke formation, something that had never happened in the decades-long history of the ceremony. The entire crowd fell silent, confused by this unprecedented break in protocol. Fellow guards behind him had to quickly adjust their steps to avoid collision. Marcus watched from the crowd as the drama unfolded. He immediately recognized the impossible position the guard had been placed in. As a Marine, he understood the weight of duty and the consequences of breaking protocol, especially in front of thousands of witnesses. He also understood the human instinct to protect an innocent child. The silence stretched on as James knelt down beside the frightened boy. Without saying a word, he gently placed his white-gloved hand on the child's shoulder and guided him back toward the crowd where his panicked parents were waiting. The gesture was simple but profound, showing that beneath the ceremonial uniform was a man with a heart. But James's troubles were just beginning. His commanding officer, who had been watching from the sidelines, was already striding toward the formation with a thunderous expression. Breaking protocol during a public ceremony was a serious offense that could result in disciplinary action, demotion, or even dismissal from the prestigious guard unit. As James resumed his position and tried to continue the ceremony, he could feel the weight of every eye upon him. The tourists were whispering among themselves, some praising his humanity while others questioned whether he had done the right thing. His fellow guards maintained their stoic expressions, but he knew they were all thinking about what consequences awaited him. Marcus felt a deep connection to what he had just witnessed. He had faced similar moments during his military career, times when following orders conflicted with doing what felt morally right. He had seen good soldiers punished for making compassionate choices in impossible situations, and it always left him feeling frustrated with the rigid nature of military justice. The ceremony continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. What started as a routine tourist attraction had become something much more significant. People in the crowd were no longer just taking pictures of colorful uniforms and traditional pageantry. They had witnessed a moment of genuine human drama that revealed the complex tensions between duty and compassion. As the guards completed their march and took their positions at their posts, James could see his commanding officer approaching. His heart raced as he prepared to face the consequences of his decision. He had no regrets about helping the child, but he knew his military career might be over before the day was finished. The crowd began to disperse, but many people lingered, sensing that something important had just happened. Among them was Marcus, who found himself unable to walk away. Something about the British Guard situation resonated deeply with his own experiences as a soldier. He had traveled thousands of miles to find peace, but instead found himself confronted with a reminder of the moral complexities that had been haunting him since his return from combat. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison approached James with measured steps, his face showing the controlled anger of a career military officer whose unit had just been embarrassed in front of an international audience. The crowd sensed the tension, and many stopped to watch what would happen next. Cell phone cameras turned toward the unfolding confrontation, capturing what was about to become a very public disciplinary moment. James stood at attention as his commanding officer reached him, but he could feel sweat forming under his heavy ceremonial uniform, despite the cool London morning. He had been in the Queen's Guard long enough to know that public displays of discipline were meant to send a message not just to the offending soldier, but to everyone watching. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stopped directly in front of James, close enough that only the guard could hear his whispered words. The officer's voice was cold and controlled as he delivered what amounted to an immediate verbal reprimand. James was ordered to report to headquarters immediately after the ceremony for formal disciplinary proceedings. The crowd watched in uncomfortable silence as this tense exchange played out. Many tourists who had moments earlier been charmed by James's kindness toward the child now felt awkward witnessing what appeared to be his punishment for that same act. Parents in the crowd found themselves explaining to their children why the nice soldier was getting in trouble for helping. Marcus observed the scene with growing frustration. He recognized the same rigid military mindset that had caused him so much internal conflict during his own service. He had watched good Marines face harsh consequences for making human decisions in inhuman situations. The sight of this British Guard being publicly humiliated for showing compassion struck him as fundamentally wrong. As the minutes passed, Marcus found himself getting more agitated. He began walking closer to where James stood, though he wasn't entirely sure what he planned to do. Other tourists moved aside as they sensed his determined approach, recognizing something different about this particular American visitor. When Marcus reached the rope barrier that separated the public from the guards, he stopped and looked directly at James. The two soldiers made eye contact across the divide that separated their different worlds, different uniforms in different countries. In that moment, something passed between them that transcended nationality and military branch. James saw in Marcus's eyes the understanding of a fellow warrior. He recognized the look of someone who had faced similar moral dilemmas and carried similar burdens. Despite never having spoken, the two men connected on a level that only soldiers who had served in combat could truly understand. Marcus felt compelled to act. He had remained silent too many times when he witnessed good soldiers being punished for doing the right thing. His own experiences in Afghanistan had taught him that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought against enemy forces, but against the systems that forget the human element of military service. Without warning, Marcus stepped over the rope barrier and walked directly toward James's position. Security personnel immediately took notice, but they hesitated because Marcus moved with such purpose and confidence that he didn't appear to be a typical tourist threat. His military bearing was obvious to anyone with experience in security matters. The crowd murmured with surprise and concern as this unexpected development unfolded. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison turned to see what was causing the disturbance and found himself face to face with a clearly American military man who had just violated the security perimeter of one of Britain's most important ceremonial sites. Marcus stopped about 3 feet from James and came to attention in the unmistakable posture of a United States Marine. He didn't speak, but his message was clear to everyone watching. He was showing solidarity with a fellow soldier who had chosen compassion over blind obedience to protocol. The standoff that followed was unlike anything anyone present had ever witnessed. Here was an American Marine, technically trespassing on British royal property, standing in silent support of a British guard who was facing punishment for helping a child. The two soldiers stood motionless, neither acknowledging the other verbally, but both understanding the significance of the moment. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison found himself in an impossible situation. He could order Marcus to leave, but doing so would create an even bigger scene and potentially escalate into an international incident. He could ignore Marcus's presence, but that would undermine his authority in front of his own troops and the watching crowd. Security personnel moved closer but received subtle signals from their supervisors to hold their positions and assess the situation before taking action. No one wanted to be responsible for creating a diplomatic incident over what appeared to be a peaceful gesture of military solidarity. The silence stretched on as hundreds of people watched this unprecedented standoff. Tourists who had come expecting a routine ceremony found themselves witnessing something far more complex and emotionally charged. Many began to understand that they were seeing something significant about military brotherhood and the universal struggles faced by soldiers everywhere. James felt a mix of gratitude and concern as he realized what Marcus was doing. While he appreciated the support, he worried that this American soldier might face consequences for his gesture. Military personnel from different countries showing solidarity was beautiful in theory, but in practice it could create complications for both men. As the minutes passed, more people in the crowd began to understand what was happening. Some started taking pictures and videos, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and shared far beyond the gates of Buckingham Palace. Social media posts began appearing within minutes, spreading the story across the internet with remarkable speed. The wordless standoff continued as more officials arrived on the scene. Palace security coordinators, police supervisors, and even diplomatic personnel began gathering at the edges of the courtyard, all trying to figure out how to handle this delicate situation. What had started as a simple ceremony had evolved into something that could have international implications. Marcus remained perfectly still, maintaining his position despite the growing attention from authorities. His years of Marine training had taught him the power of disciplined silence, and he used that knowledge now. He knew that speaking would break the spell of what was happening and potentially give officials a reason to remove him immediately. James felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was caught between his duty to remain at his post and his desire to somehow acknowledge the incredible gesture being made on his behalf. The American Marine's presence beside him felt like a shield against the criticism and punishment he knew was coming. In the crowd, people began to understand they were witnessing something extraordinary. An elderly British veteran recognized the significance immediately and began explaining to nearby tourists what the American soldier was doing. Word spread through the gathered people that this was about military brotherhood and supporting a fellow soldier who had chosen compassion over rigid protocol. A young mother, who had witnessed James helping the lost child, felt moved to tears by Marcus's gesture. She began clapping slowly, and her applause was gradually joined by others in the crowd. Soon dozens of people were applauding both soldiers, showing their support for what they perceived as an act of courage and solidarity. The applause created a new dynamic that further complicated the situation for the officials trying to manage it. Public support for both men was becoming obvious, making it much harder to simply remove Marcus or punish James without appearing heavy-handed and insensitive to popular opinion. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison realized he was losing control of the narrative. What should have been a straightforward disciplinary matter was becoming a public relations challenge that could reflect poorly on the entire Royal Guard system. He needed to find a way to resolve the situation that preserved military discipline while acknowledging the public sentiment. Marcus could feel the energy from the crowd supporting both him and James. It reminded him of moments during his deployments when civilian populations had shown appreciation for military service. But this was different because it was about supporting the human side of being a soldier, not just thanking them for their duty. A diplomatic security advisor quietly approached Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and whispered urgent advice about how to handle the American Marine. Creating an international incident over what appeared to be a peaceful gesture of support would reflect poorly on British hospitality and military relations. The advisor suggested finding a way to de-escalate without losing face. Meanwhile, social media posts about the standoff were gaining momentum online. Videos and photos taken by tourists were being shared thousands of times, with people around the world commenting on the powerful image of two soldiers from different countries standing together in silent solidarity. The story was becoming bigger than anyone at the scene had anticipated. James noticed that some of his fellow guards were stealing glances at the situation when they thought no one was looking. He could see a mix of admiration and concern in their eyes. They understood what Marcus was doing, but they also worried about the precedent it might set and the complications it could create for all of them. The lost child's parents, who had been watching the entire drama unfold from the crowd, approached the security barrier. The father, a middle-aged businessman from Germany, began speaking loudly enough for officials to hear. He praised James for helping his son and criticized the harsh response to what he called simple human kindness. This intervention from the child's father added another layer of complexity to the situation. Now it wasn't just about military protocol or international relations. It was about whether showing compassion to a frightened child should be punished or praised. The moral dimensions of the conflict were becoming impossible to ignore. Other tourists began sharing their own opinions loudly enough for the officials to hear. Many expressed support for both soldiers and criticized what they saw as an overly harsh response to James's kind gesture. The crowd was becoming an active participant in the drama rather than just passive observers. Marcus felt the momentum building around them and knew that this moment would be remembered by everyone present. He had acted on instinct when he stepped forward to support James, but now he realized his gesture had tapped into something much larger about how people viewed military service and human compassion. The palace officials were running out of time to resolve the situation quietly. Media representatives were beginning to arrive, drawn by the social media buzz and the unusual nature of the standoff. Soon this would become a full-scale news story that would be much harder to control or manage. James found himself at the center of a storm he never could have anticipated when he woke up that morning. His simple act of kindness toward a child had somehow evolved into an international moment about military brotherhood, human compassion, and the conflicts between duty and morality that soldiers face every day. As the standoff entered its second hour, it became clear that this was no longer just about two individual soldiers. It had become a symbol of larger questions about military culture, international solidarity, and whether institutions should value rigid adherence to rules over basic human decency. Everyone present sensed they were part of something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. As news crews began setting up their equipment around the palace gates, the situation reached a critical turning point. Television reporters from British, American, and international news organizations had caught wind of the story through social media and were arriving to cover what was being called the standoff at Buckingham Palace. Communications staff hurried to brief senior officials about the rapidly evolving situation. What had begun as a minor breach of protocol was now threatening to become a major international news story. Phone calls were being made to high-ranking officials in both British and American military hierarchies as the diplomatic implications became clear. Marcus could see the news cameras being positioned and knew that his decision to stand with James was about to be broadcast around the world. He thought about his family back home in Texas who would probably see this on the evening news. He wondered what his commanding officer would think about a Marine becoming the center of an international incident while on leave. James felt the pressure mounting as he realized that his career, and possibly Marcus's, hung in the balance of decisions being made by officials who were now dealing with global attention. The simple choice to help a lost child had somehow escalated into something that could affect military relations between two allied nations. In the crowd, retired British Army Colonel Robert Matthews stepped forward and identified himself to security personnel. He requested permission to speak with Lieutenant Colonel Harrison about the situation. As a decorated veteran with 40 years of military experience, his intervention carried significant weight with the officials trying to manage the crisis. Colonel Matthews approached the scene and quietly suggested to Harrison that punishing either soldier at this point would create a public relations disaster that could damage the reputation of both the Queen's Guard and British military traditions. He pointed out that the growing crowd support made it clear that the public viewed both men as heroes rather than rule breakers. American Embassy had been notified about Marcus's involvement and was sending a military attaché to assess the situation. This added another layer of diplomatic complexity, as any action taken against the Marine could potentially strain military cooperation agreements. Between the two countries, social media momentum continued, building as the hashtag #SoldierSolidarity began trending worldwide. People from dozens of countries were sharing the story and expressing support for both James and Marcus. Military veterans from around the globe were posting messages of understanding and solidarity with the two soldiers. A group of American tourists in the crowd began singing the Star-Spangled Banner in support of Marcus, while British spectators responded with God Save the King. Rather than creating division, the competing national anthems seemed to unite the crowd in appreciation for both soldiers and what they represented about military service. James's mother, who lived just outside London, received a phone call from a neighbor who had seen the news coverage. She immediately drove to Buckingham Palace, pushing through the growing crowd to get closer to where her son stood. Seeing her son at the center of an international incident filled her with both pride and worry. Marcus thought about his younger brother, who was considering joining the military. He hoped this moment would show his brother that being a soldier meant more than just following orders. Sometimes it meant standing up for fellow warriors who made difficult choices in impossible situations. The crowd had grown to over 1,000 people as word spread throughout London about the unprecedented standoff. Tour buses were being rerouted to bring more tourists to witness what guides were calling a historic moment in military brotherhood. Street vendors appeared selling British and American flags as people sought ways to show their support. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison received a phone call from his superior officer, who had been contacted by officials at the highest levels of British military command. The message was clear: find a solution that honored both military discipline and the public support for the two soldiers. The situation had become too big to handle with standard disciplinary procedures. A young British soldier in the crowd, who was off-duty and in civilian clothes, approached the security barrier and came to attention facing both James and Marcus. His gesture inspired other military personnel in the crowd to do the same, creating an impromptu honor guard of soldiers from various branches and countries. The sight of multiple military personnel showing solidarity transformed the atmosphere completely. What had started as a potential punishment scenario was becoming a celebration of military brotherhood that transcended national boundaries. Even some of the officials trying to manage the situation found themselves moved by the display. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the support, but remained focused on his original purpose. Standing with a fellow soldier who had chosen compassion over strict protocol adherence, he had not expected his gesture to grow into something this large, but he was committed to seeing it through regardless of the consequences. James realized that his decision to help the lost child had accidentally triggered something much bigger than either he or Marcus had anticipated. The standoff was becoming a symbol of the tensions that all soldiers face between following orders and following their conscience. As afternoon approached, it became clear that the situation could not continue indefinitely. Officials needed to find a resolution that satisfied the demands of military discipline, public opinion, international relations, and basic human decency. The eyes of the world were now watching to see how this unprecedented standoff would end. The pressure was building toward a climactic moment that would determine not just the fates of two individual soldiers, but potentially influence how military institutions around the world balanced rigid discipline with human compassion. Everyone present sensed that history was being made, though no one could predict exactly how it would conclude. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a black sedan pulled up to the palace gates. A tall, distinguished man in a perfectly pressed British Army uniform stepped out, carrying himself with the unmistakable authority of high command. Brigadier General William Ashworth, one of the most respected officers in the British military, had been sent personally to resolve the situation. The crowd quieted as they sensed the arrival of someone important. Ashworth had served alongside American forces in multiple conflicts and was known for his practical approach to military leadership. His reputation for fairness and wisdom had made him the obvious choice to handle this delicate international situation. Marcus recognized the general's rank immediately and felt his stomach tighten. He had been standing for over 3 hours and was beginning to understand the full magnitude of what his gesture had created. A brigadier general's personal involvement meant this had reached the highest levels of military leadership in both countries. General Ashworth walked directly to where Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stood, receiving a crisp salute and a brief situation report. The general listened without expression, occasionally glancing toward James and Marcus, who remained motionless despite the obvious strain of their prolonged stance. James felt relief at seeing General Ashworth arrive. The general had visited his unit several times and was known among the guards as someone who understood the human side of military service. If anyone could find a solution that honored both discipline and compassion, it would be Ashworth. The general approached the two soldiers slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. When he reached them, he stopped and studied both men for a long moment. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next in this unprecedented confrontation between military authority and soldier solidarity. General Ashworth spoke quietly to James first, asking him to explain his decision to break formation. James responded in the clipped, professional manner expected of a Queen's Guard, but his words carried conviction as he described seeing the terrified child and feeling compelled to help. The general listened without interruption. Then Ashworth turned to Marcus and asked him to identify himself and explain his presence. Marcus provided his name, rank, and unit, then explained that he had acted on instinct when he saw a fellow soldier facing punishment for showing compassion. His voice was steady despite the enormity of addressing a foreign general in such circumstances. The crowd watched in fascination as this three-way conversation unfolded. Many people strained to hear the exchange, but the participants spoke too quietly for most spectators to follow the details. The tension was palpable as everyone waited to learn the fate of both soldiers. General Ashworth stepped back and addressed the crowd for the first time. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command, but also warmth that surprised many listeners. He acknowledged the extraordinary nature of what they had all witnessed and thanked the public for their respectful behavior during the situation. The general explained that military discipline and human compassion were not necessarily opposing forces, though they sometimes appeared to be in conflict. He spoke about the challenges faced by soldiers who must balance following orders with making moral decisions in complex situations. His words resonated deeply with the military personnel in the crowd. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. General Ashworth announced that after careful consideration and consultation with American military officials, both soldiers would be commended rather than punished. James would receive recognition for his quick thinking in protecting a civilian, while Marcus would be acknowledged for demonstrating international military brotherhood. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause that lasted for several minutes. People waved British and American flags while chanting support for both soldiers. The relief and joy were infectious, spreading through the gathered spectators like a wave of positive energy that had been building for hours. James felt tears forming in his eyes as the reality of the general's decision sank in. Not only was he not being punished, but he was being praised for the choice that had caused him so much worry. The vindication felt overwhelming after hours of uncertainty about his military future. Marcus finally allowed himself to relax slightly, though he maintained his military bearing. The general's wisdom in finding a solution that honored both military discipline and human decency impressed him deeply. This was the kind of leadership he had always hoped to see in the military, but had rarely experienced. General Ashworth then did something completely unexpected. He asked both soldiers to accompany him in approaching the family of the child who had started this entire incident. The German tourists who had been watching the drama unfold were surprised to find themselves face to face with a British general and two soldiers who had become international celebrities. The general asked the parents to allow their son to meet the soldiers who had created such a stir on his behalf. The 5-year-old boy, who had no understanding of the complex military and diplomatic implications of what had happened, was simply excited to meet the nice soldier who had helped him find his parents. James knelt down to the child's level and accepted a small drawing the boy had made during the long standoff. The picture showed stick figures of soldiers helping a small child, demonstrating that even a 5-year-old understood the basic human kindness at the heart of the entire incident. Marcus watched this interaction with deep satisfaction. Seeing the child safe and happy confirmed that both he and James had made the right choices, regardless of the military complications those choices had created. Sometimes the most important victories had nothing to do with following orders or maintaining protocol. The general announced that both soldiers would be featured in a joint British-American military publication about the importance of international cooperation and shared values. Their story would be used to train future soldiers about balancing duty with humanitarian instincts. In the days following the standoff, both James and Marcus found themselves thrust into an unexpected spotlight that extended far beyond military circles. News organizations from around the world wanted interviews, and social media continued buzzing with discussions about their story. Neither man had anticipated becoming symbols of military brotherhood and human compassion. James returned to his regular duties with the Queen's Guard, but the atmosphere around him had changed completely. Fellow guards who had once viewed him as just another competent soldier now looked at him with new respect. His willingness to break protocol for a moral cause had elevated his status among his peers, even though some still worried about the precedent it might set. The tourist experience at Buckingham Palace transformed as well. Visitors who came for the changing of the guard ceremony often asked guides about the soldier who helped the lost child and the American Marine who stood with him. The story had become part of the palace's informal history, told and retold by guides who had witnessed the events firsthand. Marcus extended his leave in London by several days to participate in interviews and meetings that had been arranged by both British and American military public relations officials. He found himself uncomfortable with the attention, but recognized the importance of the message their story conveyed about international military cooperation and shared values. The German family whose child had sparked the entire incident remained in London longer than planned, becoming minor celebrities themselves. The father, Hans Mueller, gave interviews expressing his gratitude for James's kindness and his amazement at how a simple act of helping his son had grown into an international symbol of military brotherhood. Military academies in both countries began incorporating the story into their ethics and leadership curricula. Instructors used the incident to spark discussions about when soldiers should prioritize human compassion over strict adherence to protocol. The case study became particularly popular in courses dealing with moral decision-making under pressure. James received hundreds of letters from people around the world, many from military families who shared their own stories of soldiers facing similar moral dilemmas. Parents wrote about their children serving overseas, and how the story gave them hope that military institutions could value both discipline and humanity. Marcus discovered that his actions had resonated particularly strongly with other combat veterans who had struggled with the rigid aspects of military culture. Many wrote to thank him for standing up for a fellow soldier who had chosen compassion over blind obedience to rules. His gesture had given voice to frustrations many veterans had felt but never expressed. The relationship between James and Marcus evolved from that wordless connection during the standoff into a genuine friendship. They met several times during Marcus's extended stay in London, sharing stories about their military experiences and discussing the unexpected consequences of their moment of solidarity. British military leadership quietly reviewed protocols surrounding the changing of the guard ceremony, implementing subtle changes that would allow for greater flexibility in handling unexpected situations involving civilian safety. While they maintained the ceremony's traditional dignity, they acknowledged that rigid adherence to protocol should never compromise public welfare. American military officials used the story as an example of positive international relations and the importance of supporting Allied military personnel. Marcus received a commendation from his own command structure, recognizing his demonstration of military brotherhood and his positive representation of American values abroad. The story's impact extended beyond military circles into broader discussions about workplace ethics and institutional flexibility. Business schools began using the incident as a case study about when employees should prioritize human values over corporate policies, and when institutions should support rather than punish such decisions. James's family experienced both pride and continued worry about his military career. While they were thrilled by the positive recognition he received, they remained concerned about whether his willingness to break protocol might create future challenges with more rigid commanders who didn't share General Ashworth's enlightened perspective. Marcus's family in Texas followed the international news coverage with amazement and pride. His younger brother, who had been considering military service, was inspired by seeing how his brother had stood up for important principles even when it could have resulted in serious consequences. The 5-year-old German boy, whose Wandering had started, everything remained, blissfully unaware of the international attention his brief adventure had generated. His parents preserved news, clippings and videos of the incident to show him when he was old enough to understand the significance of what had happened. Social media continued spreading the story months after the original incident, with new posts appearing whenever people discovered the videos and articles for the first time. The hashtag #ShoeSoldierSolidarity became associated with other stories of military personnel supporting each other across international boundaries. Both soldiers began receiving invitations to speak at military events, veterans gatherings, and international conferences about leadership and ethics. While neither had sought public speaking roles, they recognized the value of sharing their experience to promote better understanding between military institutions and the public. The incident influenced military public relations strategies in both countries, demonstrating how positive stories about human elements of military service could enhance public support for armed forces. Officials realized that showing the compassionate side of soldiers actually strengthened rather than weakened public confidence in military institutions. James and Marcus maintained their friendship through regular correspondence and planned visits, creating a lasting bond that transcended the circumstances of their first meeting. Their relationship became a personal testament to the international military brotherhood they had symbolized during those tense hours at Buckingham Palace. 1 year later, James and Marcus met again at Buckingham Palace for a special ceremony commemorating the first anniversary of their famous standoff. Both men had been invited by General Ashworth to participate in a new tradition that would honor the balance between military discipline and human compassion. The ceremony attracted international attention, with military officials, diplomats, and media representatives from dozens of countries attending. The event had been designed to celebrate not just their individual actions, but the broader principle they had come to represent. The true military strength includes the wisdom to know when rules should serve humanity rather than the other way around. James had been promoted to sergeant during the year, a recognition not just of his time in service, but of the leadership qualities he had demonstrated during the incident. His fellow guards had nominated him for the promotion, citing his moral courage and his positive representation of their unit's values. Marcus had completed his military service and was now working as a counselor for veterans struggling with post-traumatic stress and moral injury. His experience of standing up for his principles during the Buckingham Palace incident had helped him process his own combat experiences and find a new sense of purpose in civilian life. The German family returned to London specifically for the anniversary ceremony, bringing their son, now 6 years old, to meet the soldiers again. The boy had grown taller and more confident, but he still remembered the kind British soldier who had helped him when he was scared and lost. During the ceremony, General Ashworth announced the establishment of the International Military Brotherhood Award, which would annually recognize military personnel who demonstrated courage in supporting fellow soldiers across national boundaries. James and Marcus would be the first recipients of this new honor. The award ceremony took place in the same courtyard where their wordless standoff had occurred exactly 1 year earlier. As they stood together again, both men reflected on how much their lives had changed since that moment when Marcus had stepped across the barrier to stand beside James. Queen Camilla herself presented the awards, acknowledging the positive impact their story had on international relations and military cooperation. Her presence elevated the ceremony to the highest levels of state recognition, emphasizing how their simple act of solidarity had touched the very heart of British society. In his acceptance speech, James spoke about the difficulty of making moral decisions in the moment, without the benefit of time to consider all consequences. He emphasized that military training should include preparation for these moral challenges, not just tactical and technical skills. Marcus addressed the international audience about the importance of supporting fellow soldiers regardless of nationality. He described how military service creates bonds that transcend political boundaries and how recognizing those bonds makes all military institutions stronger and more humane. The ceremony concluded with military personnel from 12 different countries forming an honor guard that escorted both recipients around the courtyard. This international display of military unity had been suggested by soldiers who had followed their story and wanted to demonstrate global support for the principles they represented. After the formal ceremony, James and Marcus spent time with young military personnel from various countries who had requested the opportunity to meet them. Many of these soldiers shared their own stories of moral dilemmas they had faced and expressed gratitude for having examples of how to handle such situations with integrity. The anniversary event generated renewed international media coverage, with commentators noting how the story continued to resonate with people around the world. Military experts observed that the incident had contributed to positive changes in military culture in multiple countries, encouraging more open discussion of ethical challenges in military service. James returned to his duties with the Queen's Guard that evening. But the experience had fundamentally changed how he approached his role. He continued to maintain the highest standards of military discipline while also remaining alert to opportunities to demonstrate the human values that military service should protect. Marcus flew back to Texas the next day, carrying with him a deeper appreciation for the international friendships that military service could create. His work with veterans had been enriched by his experience, and he often shared his story with clients struggling to find meaning in their own military experiences. The child who had unknowingly started it all returned to Germany with his family, carrying a photo of himself with both soldiers and a certificate declaring him an honorary member of the International Military Brotherhood. His parents planned to tell him the full story of his role in creating positive change when he was older. The standoff that had lasted only a few hours continued to influence people years later. Military academies around the world included their story in training programs. Veterans organizations used it to promote international cooperation, and countless individuals found inspiration in their example of choosing compassion over convenience. James and Marcus maintained their friendship through regular communication, planned visits, and joint appearances at military events. Their bond, forged in that moment of wordless understanding at Buckingham Palace, had grown into a lasting relationship that continued to embody the international military brotherhood they had symbolized. The story of their standoff became a permanent part of Buckingham Palace lore, told to every new guard who joined the unit and every guide who led tourists through the grounds. It served as a reminder that sometimes the most important moments in military history happen not on battlefields, but in quiet acts of moral courage that demonstrate the human heart of military service. Their legacy lived on in the countless soldiers who heard their story and found the courage to make compassionate choices in their own moments of moral challenge. The wordless standoff that had stunned everyone who witnessed it continued to speak volumes about the values that should guide military service in any country, at any time.